Hi, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about the main causes of World War I. This is by far my favorite portion of the course. I really love teaching World War I and World War II history, but I'm going to try to keep it to the point and not get off on too many tangents like I would in class. So this slide deck is in Google Classroom. It's called Main Causes World War I, and so you can follow along in there. At the end of this presentation, on the very last slide, is going to be a short video clip for you to watch, so you don't have to listen to me talk quite so much. It's under 10 minutes. I'm just going to flip the screens here so that you can see what we are going to be talking about here. And so the origins of the First World War. So when we think about the causes and origins of World War I, we're not looking at just what happens in 1914. The causes, the long-term causes of the First World War go back all the way to about 1870. But don't worry, we won't get too bogged down in the chronology of it all. We're going to break down the causes of the First World War into an acronym. MAIN, M-A-I-N, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. We're going to overview them, each of them, in terms of the long-term causes, and then you'll watch a video clip on the short-term causes. But we're not going to go through them necessarily in the order listed there. So where we're going to start is we're going to start with the alliance system. So the alliance system was essentially this like web of agreements of countries deciding to support each other. And as you can see from this complicated chart here, this evolves over time. Now, you don't need to know these specific alliances that eventually result in the Triple Entente. Ultimately speaking, there's two major alliances here, but you can see that the evolution of how they get to 1914 is changing. And one thing that's happening here, right, where you have an agreement between Austria, Hungary, and Germany in relation to Russia, and then other things. Many of these other alliances, these early alliances, are getting formed in secret behind the backs of other people that they're allied with. Okay, and so that's important to know, especially for the end of the war. But essentially, this alliance system is this web of dependence of nations forming into two power blocks that are going to ultimately be at war with each other. So when we look at who's on whose side, there's two main alliances. We have the Triple Entente. They are here in blue. The Triple Entente is with Russia, France, and Britain. Now, you may say, Ms. Delano, Britain and France had always been at war with each other for the previous few hundred years. Why are they all of a sudden on the same side? Well, now they have a common enemy in Germany. But we won't get into all of those details. So the Triple Entente, Russia, France, and Britain. And Russia is connected to Serbia. And we'll get into those details a little bit later. The Triple Alliance, on the other hand, here listed in green, that's made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Interesting note about Italy, they will not survive the war on this side. Eventually, there'll be a change in government, they will drop out, and they will join the Triple Entente. The Ottoman Empire is also on this side of the war, but the reason that they are in another color here is they're a dying empire. So while they're going to start on this side of the war, this empire is slowly dying, and all of these other countries are trying to carve out influence in that region that we now refer to as Turkey. If you look at the map, you can see these two alliances by color. So you have the Triple Alliance here in red, and you have the Triple Entente here in blue. And one thing you'll notice is that Germany has two members of the Triple Entente on either side of it. That's going to come back in handy for us here in a little bit. So these two alliances come 1914, and you can see in these bubbles when each of these alliances, pieces of the alliance get formed. But ultimately speaking, they're going to be at odds with each other very soon. Ultimately, this almost like dominoes, right? If you've ever played a game of dominoes, One domino moves, and then they all eventually fall. Our next main cause is this idea of imperialism. And if you remember from Social 10, you're in Social 20. Social 10, you talked about imperialism a lot, right? This idea of territorial and economic expansion. And this time period was no different, right? The strong ones attempted to take over the weak ones in order to expand their territorial base. And historically speaking, Britain was the great imperial power. However, as we move into the 20th century, Britain is being rivaled by Germany. And Britain feels as though Germany's increasingly, their increase in their desire for expansion is threatening Britain's economic power as the leading economic power in Europe. So that insecurity is really important. Germany, like we mentioned on the previous slide, is bordered by both Russia and France. So naturally speaking, they don't want Britain and France to have that relationship. And so they deal with some issues in North Africa, trying to break that relationship up. Other things related to imperialism. Russia, right? They had fought a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire in the 1870s and had carved out pieces of that territory from what many historians refer to as the sick man of Europe, right? That empire was dying. Russia also supported Serbia, and we'll get back to those connections to Serbia when we talk about nationalism. Ultimately speaking, they've pledged allegiance to Serbia for support, but that's not necessarily always going to be given. Austria-Hungary, we're also going to reference Austria-Hungary when it comes to our discussion on nationalism, so we'll leave that there. Serbian nationalism was a Slavic nationalism was a big issue in in Austria-Hungary, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But that Slavic nationalism was not strong enough without support from Russia. But of course, Russia's not super prepared for war, nor were they willing to fight over the Balkans in 1908, 1912, or 1913 in what's known as the Balkan Wars. So when there were wars taking place there, Serbia expected Russia to come to their aid, but Russia didn't. And so Serbian ambitions for a greater Slavic state were unsuccessful during that time period. And that also told Austria-Hungary that maybe Russia's support for Serbia wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. We'll get back to that a little bit later. When we look at the map here, right, here's Russia and here's mainland Europe. Russia has access into the Black Sea, right, because they do border the Black Sea. Russia does not border the Mediterranean Sea. So Russia has no access at this point into North Africa, down the Gulf and into the Indian area, okay? So what Russia wants is this tiny little strait right in here where my cursor is. That strait is called the Dardanelles, and it would give Russia an opportunity to expand into the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and towards India. Naturally speaking, Germany wants to push Russian influence out of this Balkan region and prevent them from gaining control of that area. And how Germany is going to do that is by financing a railway in order to increase its control in the area, in addition to giving military expertise and money to the Turks or the Ottomans. And in Social 10, you talked about the scramble for Africa. And this is where this connection to your previous course comes back into play. Historically, as you know, Britain and France had been competitors in Africa and in other parts of the world, right? France helped finance the American Revolution against Britain, for example. But come 1898, neither Britain nor France could afford war. But both had now this common concern, which was Germany. So they agreed to carve up Africa and the scramble for Africa to the exclusion of Germany and, as you know, to the exclusion of Africa. Britain gained territories in East Africa, France gained territories in North Africa and Equatorial Africa, among other nations carving a piece out as well. So by 1914, this imperialistic rivalry among these power blocs in Europe results in increasingly high tensions, distrust, heavy reliance on their allies. And what it leads states to do is build up their arms. And it creates this impending sense of doom, which leads us to this idea of militarism, right? Another one of our main causes. We've talked about these power blocks. By 1914, most countries had conscription, or what we call mandatory military service. And this meant they didn't have thousands of trained soldiers, they had millions of trained soldiers, right? To put this in context, the Canadian Armed Forces has between 60 and 80,000 professional soldiers. Europe in 1914 had millions per nation, which meant you had a lot of expendable manpower. Nations for the lead up to this time period as well were using something called gunboat diplomacy. Basically, like the flexing of their military might and their military muscles to try to intimidate an opponent to back down. We still see this today in some cases. What we also see is this idea of this arms race, the Anglo-German naval arms race. So basically, as you know, historically speaking, Britain was the had naval superiority, right? They're an island nation, and in order to colonize all of these other nations, having a strong navy was really important. And so they had a very strong one, and they had not been rivaled throughout history with that. So naval supremacy was key to global domination throughout history, as you know. Germany attempted to build a fleet that would rival it, but this was seen as an act of aggression in London. And so, but this was problematic for Germany on multiple reasons. One, they couldn't afford to continue to build battleships. It was just too expensive. And being a country on the continent bordered by multiple other countries, they began to see the idea of a standing army with infantry foot soldiers as more important to their survival than rivaling Britain's battleships. But what this shows is that Britain was very insecure, and historians believe that this helped push Britain towards that stronger relationship with France and Russia. What we see is these nations developing war plans, right? The development of these alliances from 1870 and on, right? By 1914, all of these leaders were convinced that war was inevitable and it was just going to be dependent on what match lit the spark. But everybody knew that that Balkan region was very volatile. And so what states did is they all developed war plans. And they built their war plans on timing, on railway schedules, right? Right? How are we going to move mass amounts of people and war material quickly? And so ultimately speaking, Germany had a number of concerns, largely related to Russia, because as you know, they share an eastern border with Russia. Russia was not super industrialized by this point, and so Germany worried that if war was too far away, that Russia would have finished their industrialization, military upgrades, completed its railways all the way to the Western Front, and then Germany would be doomed because they would have to fight both France and Russia at the same time. So Germany comes up with a plan, and that is the Schlieffen Plan. Ultimately speaking, right, this idea that Germany is being encircled by France and Russia, they feared that they would have to split their army into two pieces to fight this two-front war. So they developed this Schlieffen Plan. They would defeat France first because they assumed, and what do you do if you assume? It's not good. They assumed that Russia would be slow to mobilize. And so they would go defeat France first, defeat France quickly, put all their troops and their materials on trains, ship them off to the Eastern Front, and then meet Russia at the eastern border. But this had two consequences, okay? In order for this to happen, this required Germany to invade France via Belgium. And if you look at the map here, Belgium is this green country. Green in this map means neutral. Belgium does not have a big standing army. They have no desire to be involved in a war. They are a neutral country. And there are laws in place, international laws in place at this time, called the 1839 Treaty of London, that guarantee Belgium's neutrality. But where does that guarantee come from? That guarantee comes from Britain. Britain had pledged to Belgium through this Treaty of London that if they were ever invaded, that Britain would come to their rescue. So Germany invading through Belgium, big mistake, because that's going to pull the British into the war. And so, right, this border, they figure that this border with Britain, with France, because Belgium is neutral, they figure that this border is going to be undefended or very lightly defended. And so this plan necessitated Germany to involve France in a continental war, because as soon as Germany invades France, Russia's pledged to support France. This is going to bring Russia into the war. This is also going to bring the Balkans into the war, while the Balkans are going to bring everybody else into the war in reality. So their plan was designed to outflank the enemy and capture Paris down here in just a matter of weeks at a very high rate of speed, and then to put everybody on the trains and push them over to the Eastern Front. Germany was not the only country that had plans for war. All of the big powers did. France, Britain, Austria-Hungary, they all had these plans for war. But we won't get into the details of all of them. Our last main cause of the war is this idea of pan-Slavic nationalism, and we'll show you here on the map here in a few minutes. One of the few causes that Russia's ruling class could get behind was this idea of pan-Slavic nationalism on the grounds of religious and cultural similarities. Russia was horribly disunited by the early 1900s. However, they collectively were fairly on board with this idea of pan-Slavic nationalism. Since gaining independence from the Ottomans in 1886, Serbia had a desire to unite the Slavic peoples in a greater Slavic republic. Where's the map? So here is Serbia. This is Austria-Hungary. So Serbia borders Austria-Hungary, and there's a lot of Slavic people, especially in Bosnia and other southern parts of Austria-Hungary, that they believed desired to live in a greater Yugoslavia. And Russia supported these ideas. But what happens in the lead up to the war in 1908, 1912, and 1913 are two what we call Balkan Wars. And in each of these conflicts, Russia was supposed to support Serbia. But in each case, Russia backed out and never did end up supporting Serbia. This enables Austria-Hungary to annex Bosnia or take over Bosnia in 1908 to prevent nationalist uprisings on the border. This also signals to Austria-Hungary that perhaps Russia's support for Serbia is not as strong as they claim it to be, because they've backed out not once, but twice. And when we look at this map, so what you see here in color, this is the nation state of Austria-Hungary, the Austria-Hungarian Empire at the time, right? Serbia down here, the annexed area of Bosnia. And what you see here, depending on how large your computer is, these are all of the different ethnicities, ethnic groups within Austria-Hungary at the time. So in what we now call part of Austria proper now, right, you have a lot of Germans. You have a lot of Hungarians with Germans scattered throughout. You have a lot of Croats and Serbians down here. Romanians, pockets of Germans all over the place. Okay, Ukrainians up over here. And all of them with unique cultures, languages, and ideas as to how their societies should operate. So you've got a lot of ethnic nationalism, which proves Austria-Hungary to be a very challenging empire to rule. So this is where my lecture is going to pause, right? We've just talked about the long-term causes of the war. And now, how does the spark, how does everything get lit ablaze? So I want you to pause it, move to the last slide on the slide deck, and watch this short video clip that's going to look at how all of this then, with a single shot and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, so a member of the royal family, how this then caused a global war to happen. So like I said, take a quick pause. Okay, welcome back. Hope you paused it and watched the whole thing. It's important. So your task this week is this total war activity. World War I was essentially a war like no other. World War I was a conflict that was not just armies fighting armies, but entire nations fighting nations with no rules, basically. So this total war activity is going to look at some of those ideas. Trench warfare, targets of war, the home front, the role of women, and propaganda. We'll have a little something related to technology in the war a little bit later. So just follow the instructions. It's laid out step by step. You've got till Friday to complete this part. Hope you guys all have a great day. If you need any help, don't hesitate to email your classroom teacher or jump into one of their live sessions. Hakuna Matata.